There is an explanation for human creation that has not been incorporated into the dominant religious canon. This explanation has not been refuted by internal inconsistency, nor discarded for lack of antiquity or historical relevance. It has been silenced. The Book of Enoch presents a narrative about the origin of humankind that has traversed millennia, preserved in parallel traditions, kept alive in communities that never accepted its exclusion, rediscovered in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and recognized by academia as one of the oldest texts on the formation of human consciousness. The unease that led to its displacement was not in the mythology. It was in the internal logic that the text preserved. Something in the structure of this narrative exceeded the limits of what could be openly taught. The problem was never the myth, it was what it revealed about access to knowledge. The question is not whether the text is true or false in the modern factual sense. The question is why such an ancient narrative, so revered in certain circles, so preserved in multiple traditions, was systematically excluded from official discourse. What was it about this explanation of human creation that made it unassimilable? Why did it need to be displaced instead of simply ignored? The answer lies not in superficial mythological details, it lies in the logical structure that these details preserve. And this structure is profoundly unsettling when understood in its entirety. If you seek understanding, and not just summarized versions, continue. The silencing of ancient texts is not equivalent to their disappearance. Silencing is a distinct operation from destruction. When a text is destroyed, the aim is to erase its material and symbolic existence. Manuscripts are burned, copies are prohibited, those who preserve knowledge are persecuted. The destruction is violent, visible, definitive. When a text is silenced, however, the operation is more subtle and, paradoxically, more effective in the long term. The text remains, but it is displaced outside of official discourse, preserved in restricted circles, transmitted by communities that maintain their internal authority even without external recognition. It exists, but it is not cited. It is known, but it is not taught. It is accessible, but it is not legitimized. The formation of the biblical canon, both Jewish and Christian, was not a neutral selection process based solely on antiquity or authorship. It was a political and theological process involving disputes over authority, doctrinal control, and the management of knowledge deemed dangerous. Ecclesiastical councils debated which texts should be included. Rabbis of the post-temple period determined which writings belonged to the Tanakh. The decisions were not based solely on divine inspiration or spiritual value. They were also based on utility, control, and the ability to maintain doctrinal unity. Texts that presented overly complex cosmologies, overly detailed celestial hierarchies, or overly inconvenient explanations of human origins were frequently excluded, not because they were false, but because they were excessive. They made explicit what should remain veiled. They detailed what should be kept vague. They invited questions that should not be asked. The Book of Enoch fit precisely into this category. It doesn't directly contradict Genesis. It delves deeper into aspects that Genesis only suggests, and this deepening made explicit what should remain implicit. The creation narrative in Genesis is contained, controlled, without details about intermediate processes. The Book of Enoch expands, details, names, connects, and it was precisely this explicitness that made it silencing. Not because it was wrong, but because it revealed too much. Knowledge has not disappeared. It has been displaced. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved the Book of Enoch as a canonical text to this day, recognizing it as inspired scripture alongside other biblical books. For the Ethiopian tradition, there is no contradiction. There is complementarity. Aramaic and Greek fragments of the text circulated in Second Temple Judaism, demonstrating that the book was read, copied, quoted, and revered by Jewish communities before the destruction of Jerusalem. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in Qumran starting in 1947, contained multiple copies of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic, some dating from before the 2nd century BCE, evidencing its centrality in some Jewish communities before rabbinical canonization. The modern rediscovery of these manuscripts has forced academia to recognize that the Book of Enoch was not a late curiosity or a marginal invention. It was an ancient tradition, parallel to, and in some respects predating the narratives that became canonical. The displacement was deliberate. Rabbis of the period after the destruction of the temple, seeking to consolidate Judaism around the Torah and the prophets, excluded the Book of Enoch. The Church Fathers, defining the Christian canon, kept it out with rare exceptions. The decision was not based on a lack of antiquity. The text was admittedly ancient. It was not based on a lack of use. The text was even quoted in the New Testament in the Epistle of Jude. It was based on something more fundamental, the type of explanation about human creation that the text preserved. An explanation that made knowledge too central, consciousness too problematic, human responsibility too burdensome. And this explanation remained outside the official discourse for reasons that transcend mere theological divergence. Enoch is an enigmatic figure within the Hebrew tradition. Briefly mentioned in Genesis 5, he appears in a monotonous genealogy of antediluvian patriarchs, all presented with the repetitive formula: lived so many years, fathered children, and died. Adam lived 930 years and died. Seth lived 912 years and died. The formula repeats itself, generation after generation, with variations only in the numbers. Enoch breaks this pattern. The text states that Enoch walked with God 300 years and was no more, for God took him. He did not experience death. There is no tomb. There is no recorded end, just a rupture in the inevitable sequence of birth and death that defines the post-Eden human condition. This brief mention opened the way for extensive elaborations. The Book of Enoch emerges as an expansion of this narrative gap, presenting Enoch as a celestial scribe, witness to cosmic events, mediator between worlds, and bearer of knowledge about creation that transcends the narrative of Genesis. Enoch, according to the text, was taken to heaven while still alive, where he received visions about the structure of the cosmos, the origin of angels, the secrets of creation, and the destiny of humanity. He saw the foundations of the earth, the chambers of the winds, the snow deposits, the roots of the mountains. He observed the celestial hierarchies, the movements of the stars, the cycles of time. And, crucially, he witnessed the transgression of the Watchers and its consequences for humanity. Enoch's centrality before his canonization is attested by multiple references in texts from the Second Temple period. The Book of Jubilees, dating from the 2nd century BC, cites Enoch extensively and presents him as the first human to learn writing, receiving this knowledge directly from angels. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs mentions Enoch as an authority over the heavens. Fragments of commentaries found at Qumran integrate Enochian cosmology into their own apocalyptic theologies. He was not a peripheral figure. He was a recognized authority on celestial knowledge and human origins, and the text bearing his name contained explanations of creation that challenged the controlled simplicity of official narratives. The Ethiopian preservation of the complete text is a remarkable and poorly understood historical phenomenon. While Greco-Roman Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism marginalized the Book of Enoch, the Ethiopian Church maintained it as inspired scripture, including it in its official canon alongside universally recognized books. This was neither accident nor ignorance. The Ethiopian tradition inherited ancient forms of Christianity that preserved elements of Second Temple Judaism that other communities abandoned. Ethiopian Christianity maintained Jewish practices such as dietary distinctions, Sabbath observance, and male circumcision. It also preserved texts that other traditions excluded. Scholarly recognition of the text's antiquity, especially after the discovery of the Qumran fragments, confirmed that the Ethiopian version reflected genuinely ancient traditions, not medieval inventions or later adulterations. The text was there, preserved, waiting. While the West debated whether the Book of Enoch was authentic or pseudepigraphical, legitimate or heretical, the Ethiopian tradition simply read, taught, and transmitted it, and the explanation of human creation it contained remained intact, excessive, unsettling. Stay until the end. The Book of Enoch does not present human creation as a simple and straightforward event. It describes a complex process involving multiple stages, celestial hierarchies, and, crucially, the transmission of knowledge as a constitutive element of humanity. The narrative does not begin with the formation of the human body, that is presumed, accepted as given. The narrative begins with observation. The Watchers, celestial beings described as high-ranking angels, were tasked with observing human creation. The Hebrew term preserved in the Aramaic fragments suggests vigilance, guarding, protection. They were to observe without interfering. They were to witness the development of humanity without altering its course. They were to maintain an appropriate distance between the celestial and the terrestrial. According to the text, these watchers did not limit themselves to observation. They descended. The descent was not an accident. It was a collective decision, led by figures named in the text: Semyaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Hokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel. 200 watchers, according to the Book of Enoch, swore among themselves to descend to earth and take human women for themselves. They descended on Mount Hermon, a location that becomes significant in the tradition, a real, geographically identifiable mountain in northern ancient Canaan. The text is specific. There is no mythological vagueness. There is geography, names, numbers. But the central problem, according to the Book of Enoch, was not merely the sexual union between the Watchers and human women, although this is mentioned and generates its own consequences. The Nephilim, giants who later become a source of violence. The fundamental problem was the transmission of knowledge. The Watchers did not simply descend and interact physically. They taught. And what they taught irreversibly altered humanity's capacity to intervene in the world. The Book of Enoch is explicit and detailed about this. Azazel taught men the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, military technology. He taught women bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony to beautify the eyes, precious stones and dyes, cosmetic technology, and manipulation of appearance. Semyaza taught incantations and root cutting, witchcraft, and primitive pharmacology. Armaros taught the resolution of spells. Barakel taught astrology. Hokabiel taught the signs of the constellations. Tamiel taught astronomy. Azradel taught the movements of the moon. This is not abstract or merely spiritual knowledge. It is practical knowledge. Knowledge that alters the technical capacity to transform the world. Metallurgy allows the creation of weapons. Weapons alter power relations. Cosmetics alter appearance, and, with it, social dynamics. Astrology and astronomy alter the understanding of the cosmos, and, with it, the perception of time, calendars, and agricultural cycles. Witchcraft and pharmacology alter the capacity to intervene in health, disease, and consciousness. Each piece of knowledge transmitted by the Watchers expanded human capacity. And it was precisely this expansion that generated the imbalance. Human creation, in this narrative, was not complete the moment the body was formed and consciousness awakened. It was completed when knowledge was transmitted, and it was in this transmission that the problem arose. Human beings were technically empowered without developing proportional moral wisdom. They gained power without gaining responsibility. They acquired knowledge without acquiring maturity. The result, according to the text, is systemic collapse, widespread violence, social corruption, disintegration of community structures. Knowledge was not neutral. It amplified capabilities without amplifying discernment, and the consequences were catastrophic. The narrative doesn't blame knowledge itself. There's no condemnation of knowledge as such. The text doesn't suggest that humanity should remain eternally ignorant. The fault lies in the timing. The transgression was structural, not moral in the conventional sense. Something was delivered too early. Something was revealed before there was adequate foundation. Humanity wasn't ready. There wasn't enough collective maturity. There wasn't enough accumulated wisdom. There weren't ethical structures proportionate to the newly acquired technical capabilities. And this mismatch generated destruction. This is deeper than it seems. The judgment that follows, in the cosmology of the Book of Enoch, is not arbitrary punishment. God is not reacting capriciously or authoritatively. The judgment is a systemic response to an imbalance introduced prematurely. The earth cries out. Humanity self-destructs. The transgressing watchers are imprisoned in places of darkness until the final judgment. Their children, the Nephilim, are destroyed, and the earth itself is purified through the flood, an event that connects the Book of Enoch directly to the Genesis narrative. The flood, in both traditions, is not merely moral punishment. It is a necessary restart after systemic collapse. It is recognition that something fundamentally went wrong and needs to be reconfigured. The explanation of human creation preserved in the Book of Enoch is, therefore, deeply unsettling. It suggests that humanity was not created ready-made. It suggests that knowledge is constitutive of humanity, not accidental. It suggests that there is an intrinsic danger in unrestricted access to knowledge. And it suggests that the primordial transgression was not disobedience to an arbitrary command, but an overstepping of structural boundaries before there was maturity to deal with the consequences. This is a radically different explanation from the controlled narrative of Genesis. And it was precisely this difference that made the text unpalatable. The language of the Book of Enoch is symbolic, theological, and mythological. It is not a scientific treatise on human origins. It does not pretend to be modern historiography, but the logical structure it preserves is recognizable and transcends specific mythology. Creation as a process, knowledge as a catalyst, consciousness arising before maturity, collapse resulting from the disproportion between technical capacity and ethical wisdom. This structure is not exclusive to the Book of Enoch. It resonates across multiple ancient traditions, and it was precisely this resonance that made the text dangerous. It made explicit what other narratives only suggested. It named what should remain implicit. It detailed what should be kept vague. Genesis presents human creation in a contained manner. God forms humankind from the dust of the earth and breathes into their nostrils the breath of life. Matter and spirit. Body and consciousness. Two elements, one creative act. Immediate result. Simple, controlled, without details about intermediate processes, without mention of secondary agents, without discussion about the transmission of knowledge. Genesis 2 expands slightly. Humankind is placed in the garden to cultivate and guard it, receives command over the trees, names the animals, receives a companion. There is structure, there is order, there is command. but there is still narrative restraint. Genesis 6, however, introduces a disturbing break. After genealogical chapters tracing the lineage from Adam through Seth to Noah, the text states, "When men began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from all whom they chose." The text is cryptic. It doesn't explain who the sons of God are. It doesn't detail what happened. It doesn't clarify the implications. And then it adds, "There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." Immediately following this enigmatic passage, the text states that God saw that the wickedness of man had multiplied on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And God regretted that he had made man and decided to destroy humanity through the flood, preserving only Noah and his family. The sequence is clear: sons of God, plus daughters of men, au Nephilim, phau widespread wickedness, outer flood. But the details are missing. It's a suggestion, a fissure in the narrative, a point where something unsettling is mentioned but not explained. The Book of Enoch expands precisely on this fissure. It identifies the sons of God as the Watchers. It names their leaders. It details the descent. It lists the knowledge transmitted. It describes the consequences. It directly connects the intervention of the Watchers to the moral collapse that justified the flood. What Genesis suggests in a few cryptic verses, Enoch develops in detailed chapters. What Genesis keeps veiled, Enoch makes explicit. And it was this explication that made the text silencing. The texts do not cancel each other out. They operate on different levels of the same explanation. The Book of Jubilees, another Second Temple period text considered authoritative by Ethiopian tradition, and found in multiple copies at Qumran, also preserves this expanded narrative of the Watchers, confirming that it was not an isolated invention of the Book of Enoch, but an interpretative tradition widely accepted in certain Jewish circles before rabbinic canonization. Jubilees adds its own details. The Watchers originally descended to teach justice and righteousness, but were corrupted by desire. The text preserves the same structure: descent, transgression, transmission of inadequate knowledge, collapse, judgment. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Qumran community, generally identified as Essenes, or a related sectarian group, considered the Book of Enoch authoritative. They possessed multiple copies of the Aramaic text, quoted it in their own writings, and integrated its angelic and apocalyptic cosmology into their own theology. The Damascus document, a sectarian text found both in Qumran and in the Cairo Geniza, mentions the Watchers and their transgression as a historical event. The War Scroll describes angelic hierarchies consistent with Enochian cosmology. The Qumran group did not see a contradiction between Enoch and Genesis. They saw complementarity and deepening. The subsequent exclusion of the Book of Enoch from the rabbinic and Christian canon was therefore not the result of ignorance or irrelevance. It was the result of deliberate choice. Rabbis of the post-70 CE period, rebuilding Judaism after the destruction of the Temple, consolidated a more restricted canon focused on the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Excessively detailed apocalyptic texts about angelic hierarchies, texts that gave prominence to celestial figures besides God, texts that explained too much about the origin of evil and the nature of primordial transgression were marginalized. The Book of Enoch fell into this category. The Church Fathers, defining the Christian canon between the 3rd and 5th centuries, also excluded Enoch, with the exception of the Ethiopian tradition. Tertullian, a 3rd century theologian, defended the authenticity of the Book of Enoch, but his position did not prevail. Jerome, translator of the Latin Vulgate, rejected the text. Augustine considered it apocryphal. The decision was not based on a lack of antiquity. The text was admittedly ancient and quoted in the New Testament. It was not based on a lack of use. Early Christian communities read it. It was based on something more fundamental, the type of explanation about human creation and the origin of evil that the text preserved. An explanation that distributed responsibility in a complex way, that involved multiple celestial agents, that made knowledge central and problematic, that demanded sophisticated reflection on human nature, conscience, and ethical responsibility. It was too complex, too risky, too explicit. Few people notice this. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1945, present another layer of this same fundamental structure concerning knowledge and human creation. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Secret Book of John, texts that circulated in early Christian communities but were excluded from the Orthodox canon. In these texts, human creation is frequently presented as the work of an imperfect demiurge, a secondary creator called Yaldabaoth, or Saklas, who forms the human body but is unable to animate it properly until Sophia, a feminine figure of divine wisdom, breathes into it a spark of the pleroma, the true divine realm. In these Gnostic texts, salvation does not come through obedience or simple faith, but through gnosis, true knowledge. Human beings are imprisoned in matter by ignorance. The serpent in the Garden of Eden, in some Gnostic interpretations, is a positive figure. It brings knowledge that liberates. The creator God of matter is a negative figure. It keeps humanity in ignorance. The structure is inverted in relation to the Orthodox view, but the central element remains. Knowledge is constitutive, transformative, dangerous, and liberating simultaneously. The language is different. The context is different. The specific cosmology is different. But the logical structure resonates. Knowledge as a constitutive and transformative element of the human condition, access to knowledge as a dangerous event that fundamentally alters the relationship between humanity and transcendence, consciousness as a factor that distinguishes the imprisoned human from the awakened human. Gnostic texts were similarly excluded from the Christian canon. The coincidence is not accidental. Narratives that made knowledge central and explicit, that complicated the relationship between creation and salvation, that demanded sophisticated reflection instead of simple obedience, were systematically marginalized. The texts do not cancel each other out. They operate on different levels of the same explanation. Genesis preserves the controlled version, direct, simple creation, without details about intermediate processes or transmission of knowledge. God creates, commands, judges. Humans obey or disobey. The consequences are clear. The narrative is manageable. The Book of Enoch preserves the expanded version, creation as a complex process, knowledge as a catalyst, intervention of multiple celestial agents, imbalance resulting from inadequate timing. Responsibility is distributed. Transgression is structural. The consequences are systemic. The Gnostic Gospels preserve the internalized version. Knowledge as spiritual awakening. Ignorance as imprisonment. Salvation as recognition of the inner divine spark. Creation is the problem. Knowledge is the solution. Each text operates on a different level, but all point to the same fundamental tension: the relationship between knowledge and maturity, between technical ability and ethical wisdom, between conscience and responsibility. And it was this tension that made certain texts silencing. They could not be destroyed. They were too old, too revered in certain communities, preserved in multiple copies. But they could be displaced, kept out of official discourse, excluded from the canon. preserved only in circles that understood the implications without losing control. Keep this part in mind. The unsettling escalation in the Book of Enoch isn't just in the narrative of the Watchers. It's in the recurring structure the text preserves, a structure that runs throughout the prophetic and apocalyptic tradition. Knowledge has always demanded restraint. Transgression was intellectual before it was moral. Collapse doesn't result from disobedience to arbitrary commands. It results from an imbalance between capacity and maturity. This pattern isn't unique to the Book of Enoch. It runs through the prophetic texts of the Old Testament, reappears in the Jewish apocalypses of the Hellenistic period, and culminates in the apocalypse of John in the New Testament. There is always a warning about exceeding limits. There are always consequences for premature impulses. There is always structural, not arbitrary, judgment. Isaiah, an 8th century BC prophet, repeatedly warns against those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own conceit. Self-sufficient human wisdom is presented as hubris. Jeremiah, 7th century BC, denounces those who trust in human wisdom instead of knowledge of God. Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom. Technical knowledge without ethical foundation is empty. Ecclesiastes, a wisdom text traditionally attributed to Solomon, but probably from the Hellenistic period, explicitly states, "In much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow." Knowledge brings not only benefit, it also brings burden. Proverbs constantly distinguishes between wisdom that begins with the fear of the Lord and wisdom that is merely technical or instrumental. Daniel, an apocalyptic text composed during the Hellenistic period, presents visions where hidden knowledge is revealed only to the chosen, and this knowledge is always related to the end times, judgment, and the collapse of empires. Apocalyptic knowledge is not neutral. It is knowledge about surpassed limits and inevitable consequences. The Apocalypse of John, the last book of the New Testament, operates on the same structure: progressive revelation of knowledge about the end, warnings about powers that surpass limits, and cosmic judgment as a systemic response. The pattern is consistent across centuries and traditions. Knowledge without a proper foundation is dangerous. Knowledge that advances faster than ethical maturity is destructive. And there are limits that should not be prematurely crossed. The Book of Enoch preserves this same logic, but in such an explicit, detailed, and concrete way that the text has become unassimilable to the official canon. It did not merely suggest, it made explicit. It did not merely warn vaguely, it named the agents, listed the knowledge, and described the consequences. The text concludes that the Book of Enoch preserves a deep and recurring logical structure regarding the human condition. The true danger lies not in the existence of knowledge, but in the moment it is accessed and in the absence of proportional ethical maturity. The Apocalypse of John remained in the Christian canon precisely because it is symbolic, ambiguous, and controllable. The Book of Enoch, on the other hand, was silenced for being too direct, for naming agents, processes, and consequences, explicitly connecting knowledge, consciousness, and collapse. This structure is not exclusive to the Judeo-Christian tradition. It spans cultures and eras, reappearing in Sumerian, Greek, Hindu, and Chinese myths, all warning of the danger of premature access to transformative knowledge. The pattern is always the same. When technical ability grows faster than moral wisdom, imbalance sets in. The problem has never been knowledge itself, but the lack of ethical preparation to sustain it. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers do not destroy humanity. They empower it too early. They deliver tools before responsibility, technology before maturity, awareness before restraint. The ensuing collapse is not arbitrary divine punishment, but an inevitable structural consequence of the imbalance between power and wisdom. This same logic manifests itself in a disturbing way in the present. Humanity is developing artificial intelligence, biotechnology, weapons of mass destruction, and algorithmic systems of social control at an exponential rate, while collective ethics, regulation, and understanding of the consequences advance slowly. The old pattern repeats itself. Expanded capabilities without proportional maturity generate systemic instability. The Book of Enoch was silenced because it demanded radical responsibility, continuous reflection, and conscious restraint. It offered neither simple obedience nor unquestioning faith. It transformed human creation into a permanent ethical problem, and knowledge into a burden requiring constant discernment. This complexity made it incompatible with religious structures that sought control through simplicity. The explanation never disappeared. It was marginalized, preserved outside of official discourse, and later rediscovered. And it remains relevant because it is neither prophecy nor religious dogma, but a recurring historical pattern. The final question left open by the text remains urgent and inescapable. Is there sufficient ethical maturity to sustain the level of knowledge and power that humanity has already achieved? Or are we, once again, repeating the same structural cycle of collapse?